The Marcellus shale rush had made Ken Ely a rich man, at least by his standards of rural northeastern Pennsylvania, where he grew up and made a living as a quarryman and equipment operator. When the water started turning bad near drilling rigs on his family's land, he was making enough in royalties to move just about anywhere he liked, but he wasn't going to abandon his mountain. On the morning of March 24th, 2009, a mild late winter day, Ken pulled a piece of plywood from a log bunker that he used for storage. He painted a message to the company drilling on his land in large red letters. He then loaded the sign into his Bronco and drove up the access road along the ridge of his mountain. At the midpoint of the ridge, halfway to a gas well on the northern boundary of his property, he pulled off into his quarry and parked next to a front-end loader and several pallets of bluestone. He transferred the sign, along with some bottles, rags, and a gasoline tank he had with him, into the cockpit of the loader, and then climbed on board and settled in behind the controls. He maneuvered the machine's forks under a pallet of bluestone. Once loaded, he steered toward the road along the ridge, where tanker trucks were hauling fluid to the north end of his property. He waited for a break in traffic, then squared his machine to the line of oncoming tankers. He lowered the pallet and climbed out with the sign. Road closed until further notice. An approaching tanker carrying water to be mixed with chemicals at the site to frack the well downshifted and rolled to a stop in front of Ken's blockade. The driver set the brake with a blast of compressed air and climbed out of the cab to talk with Ken. After a brief exchange, the driver looked at the gasoline tanks and rags in the cockpit of Ken's tractor, climbed back into the truck, and radioed the crew boss. Another truck rolled to a stop behind him, and then another. A few minutes later, men arrived in pickups to talk to Ken. They told him he would have to move one way or another, and it would have to be sooner rather than later. Ken had effectively blocked access to the wells on his property and shut down Cabot Oil's fracking operation. The next day, March 25th, Cabot filed a complaint in the U.S. District Court seeking an injunction to force Ken to move. The complaint claimed that Ken had threatened to firebomb the equipment if anybody tried to move him out of the way. Ken denied that intention, but made no effort to dispel the belief. Let them think what they would. The complaint filed by the company cited Ely's lease with Cabot, which granted the company, quote, "the right of ingress and egress, along with the right to conduct such operations on the leased premises, as may be reasonably necessary for such purposes, including, but not limited to, geophysical operations, the drilling of wells, and the construction and use of roads, canals, pipelines, tanks, water wells, disposal wells, injection wells, pits, electric and telephone lines, power stations, and other facilities to discover, produce, store, treat, and/or transport product." In other words, the gas company had broad legal standing to do what it found necessary to find and remove gas or other product from Ken's land. The court granted the injunction, which was promptly issued. Ely complied. The event, which lasted less than 2 days, cost the company about $3,000 per hour in downtime. Word got around. Roughnecks talked about it with locals, and soon the tale was being passed through the community. The particulars of some of these stories differed from the account spelled out in Cabot's complaint filed in the court, as well as from recollections conveyed by his son, Scott. In some versions, the gas cans and rags were dynamite, and Ely was armed with a shotgun. But the general image was the same, an armed Ken Ely standing up to a fracking convoy. To some who knew him as independent and contrary, the act of defiance was an example of Ken being Ken. In the minds of others, it brought him folk hero status. A radical environmentalist may have applauded Ken's actions, but there was a difference between this standoff and those by activists who chained themselves to trees. Activists are bent on drawing attention to an issue. For Ken, the conflict was deeply personal.